Let me turn my attention to Vice Chair Barr for a minute here on I think the importance of Basel III being reproposed. Honestly, I think slicing it, dicing it, trying to figure out how to make some changes and put it back on the market, I think that's probably the wrong strategy, the wrong approach. From my perspective, it would be much better to have a full reproposal, allowing people to have another window of opportunity to actually have input in the process of the changes. Frankly, Basel III to me, thankfully, Fed, you, Chairman Powell have made a prudent decision to take another look at the proposal. That's a prudent decision. I think a better approach is to actually put it back out on the market for comment so that more people have a better engagement in this process. That anything other than that, I think, is nibbling around the edges and will not produce the type of product that is in America's best interest. Thoughts?
Thank you very much, Senator Scott. We're really focused right now on the substance. We had a lot of deep and thoughtful comments on the proposal. We're trying to work our way through that substance now, reach agreement across the agencies and with my board on the substance. And after we're done with that process of understanding where we want to go on the substance, we'll then determine what process we think is appropriate. If a reproposal ends up being appropriate, we'll do that. We're not yet at the stage where we're thinking about precisely what process we'll use.
I certainly think the more, obviously you understand this, but for the Americans watching C-SPAN for reasons that go beyond my ability to comprehend, I think it's important for us to note that the capital standards within Basel III park so much capital on the sidelines that those Americans perhaps watching C-SPAN looking for their first mortgage will have less capital to actually become a part of the American dream, to actually earn equity in this nation by having a home. Those small businesses like me that changed my financial life and the life of my family, specifically my mom's, by starting a business and being successful, that capital that allows folks like me coming from poverty to experience the American dream because you have the ability to get a loan, parking more capital on the sidelines really is a way of disenfranchising more Americans and not necessarily making the system more fair. Thank you for your comments and thank you for the call and having a conversation about this really important underlying issue that will have real impact on our economy. To Chairman Grunberg, the offices haven't failed. You have. It's that simple. An environment that is so corrosive, so toxic, that employees, I just want to read this from the report because the level of intimidation that is embedded in the culture after a decade of your leadership, you can't just unravel it. You can't unscramble that egg. The going to classes and looking for ways to have anger management and solve that problem. If it takes you a decade to recognize that, perhaps you need a whole few years away from the FDIC to figure that out on your own. But why punish the FDIC and the American people and, frankly, the employees? Here's a quote from one employee. Nobody trusts those in charge. And even though it is not getting into the hands of senior executive, I'm using VPN and someone else's cell phone to write this. I still fear that talking will come back to haunt me. Those are chilling words. I have so many complaints and concerns through the report that it's just hard to read them all. A woman learned that a field office supervisor had romantic feelings for her and would send her flowers. He would demand to know who she was talking to and what she was talking about. He called and texted her at work and at home. During mandatory telework, he would insist that she stay on team videos for hours on end, directing her to leave the video on when she left to use the restroom. She became so fearful, she went to the police and considered seeking a restraining order. She hesitated to file a complaint with the FDIC because she believed the agency would believe him over her if she reported it. Eventually, when she did work up the courage to file, She said managers dismissed her concerns. The report concludes she continues to live in fear. You got 5,000 employees plus, and the strategy is to give them more pay, more promotion, and to transfer for folks maybe in leadership. If after a decade of toxicity and corrosion, 5,000 employees, the best we can do is find a scapegoat, shift the blame, you should resign.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Cortez Masto is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listening to you today, Deputy Secretary, it feels like digital assets has become the scapegoat of this administration because with all that's going on in the world, the only legislative requests you have sent to this committee are new authorities related to cryptocurrency. And I will say that if China buys about 90% of the Iranian oil and we make it easier to sell the Iranian oil, if in last August we saw $6 billion transferred to the Iranians for, in my opinion, hostage relief, $10 billion allowing electricity waivers, none of that's happening in digital assets. They're literally using our cash. We're making it easier for them to use euros. The bottom line is this, that if $35 billion represents the export of oil from Iran, none of which is purchased using digital assets, having a conversation simply and exclusively about digital assets misses the elephant in the room, that every single time we make it easier for the Iranian regime to receive resources from the United States in cash, pallets of cash, or through electricity waivers, use euros or license, we put more and more Americans and our allies in harm's way, and that includes Israel. And so for us to have a conversation that sounds like a digital asset conversation, as opposed to a conversation about illicit financing that is far larger than digital assets, to me, makes it into a scapegoat. I'd love to hear why the Treasury Department made it a determination to change the recent electricity waivers to allow for the use of euros. Was that a request from the Iranians?
So, Senator, just for the record, that is an authority that the State Department has. But I think the most important thing to point out here is that on both the electricity waiver, but also the $6 billion, both of those are monies that are tied up in financial institutions. None of that money will ever see its way to Iran. At most, that money can be used to purchase things outside of Iran. The challenge here is that while we can stop that money from financial institutions moving to Iran, I don't have the authorities to stop cryptocurrencies from moving into Iran. That's why I've asked for those authorities. But fundamentally, what I can say is that $6 billion you mentioned.
Let's have a conversation about this for just a second. You are a highly educated, brilliant man. To sit here and to suggest that you don't understand us giving around $6 billion that they will be able to use at some point. And then the administration said they can't use it for this purpose, but they can use it for that purpose. Money's fungible. I mean, you don't have to be as educated as you are to know that money's fungible. So the bottom line is simply this. Anytime we allow the Iranians to have more access to cash, euros, balance sheets, we are making it easier for their proxies to use their resources to target Americans, as has been done for the last several months. In addition to that, our allies. Anytime we relax the regime that makes it harder for them to sell oil, making it easier for them to do so, with China happily purchasing those resources, we don't have to be that smart to realize that all of this makes it harder on our allies and deadly for our service members. So I just find it preposterous that we would posit a position that suggests that those resources have no impact on what Iran is doing. And frankly, if that were the case, we would not have released them at all.
Senator, can I make a point?
Please. Oh, yes, sir.
So, Senator, you're right that in a democracy, money is fungible. But what we've seen time and time from the Iranian regime is they fail to feed their people and they put the IRGC first. Any dollar they have will go towards their violent activity before they deal with their people. That's partially why almost none of the humanitarian money has been used for humanitarian purposes, is they don't care about getting drugs and food for their people. But the difference is that the United States of America has made as a values proposition that we are always going to provide humanitarian relief for people. And that's what we've said is the only purpose for this money. So while in our country, money is fungible, in Iran, they've proven that any dollar they get that they have direct access to in the country will be used for the IRGC before it's ever used for their people.
Well, Secretary, just because I'm not the chairman of this committee and he is, he's going to cut me off as soon as I say something he doesn't like. So let me just suggest this. You and I actually agree on that point, that the Iranian regime does not care about the Iranian people. Therefore, any relaxation that allows their economy to thrive or survive is for one purpose, for them to carry out their primary objective, which is spreading terrorism throughout the Middle East and eliminating the little Satan and then the big Satan. That would be Israel and America.
Ranking Member Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here with us this morning. Listening to our chairman, Democrats would have Americans believe that the economic pain they're feeling is caused by greedy corporations putting a few less chips in your chip bag. It couldn't be more clear where the obvious pain is coming from. The obvious pain is coming from a guy who lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The bottom line is that President Biden and Bidenomics has devastated our economy and devastated people working paycheck to paycheck. The highest percentage of Americans with the fewest dollars in their savings account for an emergency is now because of President Biden and Democrats' reckless spending. They like to name their bills in attractive ways, but the bottom line is a very simple thing. They all add to inflation, whether it's the American Rescue Plan, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, or the worst named bill perhaps in American history, the Inflation Reduction Act. Anyone who believes that inflation has gone down because of the Inflation Reduction Act, all you have to do is look at the latest information coming out of the Federal Reserve itself. Inflation continues to increase. These bills used to be hailed positively as a part of Bidenomics, but now they're just economics because no one can afford President Biden's approach to solving the problems that we see in our nation. And I know this to be true because it doesn't matter whether I'm at home in South Carolina or any other state around the country, I keep hearing the same things from consumers. Rent is too high. I'll never be able to afford a mortgage. I'm living paycheck to paycheck. My grocery bills are staggering and I can barely afford them. Or I spent my entire life working and building up enough savings just to retire. But now I'm worried that those savings won't go far enough and I'll have to go back to work. Or I'm really worried about my finances and our economy. And they always end with a simple question. What can you do to help me? The number one concern, besides the devastation that Americans are experiencing because of an unsafe, insecure, wide open southern border, the number one concern outside of that border is the economy. And Americans across the country point their fingers at the devastation of inflation. Inflation today is costing the average American family an additional $8,508 just to buy the same things they were able to buy before President Biden took office. It is truly unfortunate that the Biden administration continues to play a game of deflection, not taking responsibility, not solving the problem, but looking for someone else to blame other than the man in the mirror. First, the Biden administration has told us that the challenges that we were seeing with inflation was transitory. I cannot tell you the number of hearings I sat through, whether it was Secretary Yellen or others, who said that this is transitory because of COVID. Well, then they changed the story that it was the Putin's price hike because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Then it was greedflation or shrinkflation. The fact of the matter is simply Biden's inflation. Here's the truth. The Biden administration's spending policies has caused the inflation that we're seeing and the economic devastation it is producing. They are the key contributors to the price hikes we are all experiencing today. Let's take a step back to understand what inflation really feels like to the average American. Prices across the board have certainly increased nearly 20% since Biden took office. Yes, 20% increase in just over 3 years. For example, butter's up 27%, chicken 26%, white bread 30%. When you go to the pump, you don't have to believe what President Biden says about the challenges. All you have to do is see the price at the pump, 40% increase. Energy costs, 25% increase. I could spend the rest of my time this morning discussing other examples of how much prices have increased. But the American people know all too well that the challenges that they face and where it comes. That's why they trust him so little on the economy. It is crystal clear. They know what they see with their own eyes. Yet, instead of looking at ways we can bring inflation down, this administration continues to look for scapegoats, such as corporate America. But here's what the Federal Reserve recently studied. The Federal Reserve studied the administration's claims that corporations are driving up inflation and came to the conclusion, and I'll just read it, unprecedented large and direct government intervention and accommodative monetary policy. Profits were back to their pre-pandemic levels by the end of 2022. With respect to shrinkflation, the Biden administration's own BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, reported that its effects have resulted in a 0.01% average annual increase to prices and has a very small impact on the overall inflation picture. I know this is really uncomfortable for some of you to listen to it, but that's just called the facts. What we should be talking about today is the direct harm this administration's policies are causing as they continue to lead to more inflation. We should be talking about the inflation spike we are likely to see after billions and billions of dollars in student loans are illegally forgiven by this administration. We should be talking about a federal debt that is growing by trillions of dollars every single year. The American people are smart. They see through this blatant attempt by this administration to blame others for the inevitable results of their policies. It's time for the Biden administration and their friends on the other side of the aisle to wake up, smell the coffee that now costs 30% more. Out of control, reckless spending led to runaway inflation that has remained elevated for years now. We must all accept the fact and return to sound economic policies that make affording the basics just a bit easier for the American family. With that, I yield back and look forward to asking some questions.
I hear it's a harder rock and roll.
And other things.
I'll direct my first question to Senator Tester and the hoverboard. Having been on for 7 seconds, sir, are you sure you didn't order either one of those hoverboards?
I wouldn't know how to ride one of those doggone things if I had one, much less two at a time.
Well, that's why you remain healthy. Those things are crazy. Anyways, thank you for the comic relief there, Senator Tester. We needed that. Yes, sir. As I've emphasized in my opening statement, financial fraud and bad actors are not new. Check fraud, for instance, has been around, from my perspective, forever, since we've had checks, it seems like. And yet, surprisingly, despite many of the technological advancements that we've seen in the financial industry, check fraud incidents nearly doubled from 2021 to 2022, and it's on pace to increase even more in 2023. Mr. Benda, can you please explain how the majority of check fraud is being conducted today and who check fraud impacts the most?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Scott. So check fraud is a big challenge for us today, and really it impacts Americans of all types. The challenge we've got is, and it started with the fact that the mail system isn't nearly as secure as we thought. So we're seeing a huge increase in the theft of mail. We're seeing mail carriers being assaulted so that they could steal the mail as well as steal the arrow keys that are there. And what this allows the criminals to do is actually gain access to these checks. And unfortunately, the marketplace today allows them access to tools we didn't even dream of 20 years ago. They have they can access chemicals to wash these checks. They can access card stock from overseas suppliers so they can print checks that look exactly alike. Frankly, it's a very challenging fight for us to try and stop these trends unless we can start securing the mail.
So to that point, if someone can literally just steal the check from the mailbox, what should we be doing to educate consumers about check fraud that we're not doing right now?
I think there's a lot of efforts underway to educate consumers. That's why ABA entered a partnership with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. But I think people need to recognize that if you give someone your name, your address, your bank account number, and the bank routing number, you're giving them access to your bank account potentially. And so looking at other more secure forms of payment. Senator Tester talked about credit cards that may not be viable all the time, but ACH and other forms of payments can be useful ways to transfer money.
Thank you. I frequently hear from bankers across the country about their frustration with the government's handling of suspicious activity reports, or SARS, and the effectiveness of our anti-money laundering regime. Bankers spend significant resources filing SARS and FinCEN, which are intended to help catch criminals and prevent abuse within the financial system. But more often than not, millions of SARS are essentially sent into a black box where banks receive no feedback, and most of which are never acted upon by agency personnel or law enforcement. Again, Mr. Benda, you have spent most of your professional life working in fraud and cybersecurity. Having worked with both law enforcement and financial institutions, do you believe that the current system is working efficiently?
I think there are definitely improvements that can be made to the current system. I know there is frustration on the bank sides, and I know there's frustration on the law enforcement side. I think better coordination between law enforcement and private sector, a feedback mechanism so that banks understand what law enforcement is looking for, so it can provide them the information they need. But then again, law enforcement providing tips and tactics and trends so that banks can better protect their customers from fraud.
Great. As I stressed in my opening statement, consumer education is critically important when it comes to preventing or trying to reduce that sort of fraud. It breaks my heart that someone will place a check in their mailbox, assuming they are paying a bill or sending money to their loved one, only to find out that a stranger is taking it. It seems that ABA is working around the clock to figure out ways to protect consumers and help institutions ensure this sort of fraud won't happen again. In fact, ABA has worked to develop a check fraud claim directory that provides contact information for banks to file a check warranty breach claim with another financial institution. Can you walk us through the ins and outs of how this directory works, Mr. Benda, and the importance of it?
So we know this doesn't solve the check fraud problem, but we're trying to do what we can. One of the challenges banks have is finding out who's the right point of contact to send that claim to so they can get reimbursed for it, so they can provide those funds back to the consumer. But we've taken it further than that. We recognize check fraud is happening to all Americans, and we're trying to figure out ways that we can make filing the claims from the customer perspective easier. Trying to get rid of things such as requiring notarizations or payee affidavits. Trying to make sure that when a decision is made, the customer is reimbursed more quickly. It's a challenge. It's a very complex thing to do, but we are working to try and make this process better for banks and customers alike.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Menendez of New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary, thank you for being here with us this morning. Today is an important opportunity to discuss American leadership, especially on the global stage. I've often said that we, the United States, must leverage our international toolkit to stop bad actors, curb illicit activity, and protect American families. Thankfully, agencies like the Treasury Department already have robust toolkits available, as well as, in instances where additional direction is needed, I have not shied away from providing more resources and direction, like those in my fentanyl legislation and my Revoke Iranian Funding Act as well. So I appreciate having you here with us this morning. South Carolina is a proud home to many of our U.S. service members, their families, and our veterans. I'm proud of this fact and my important duty to serve their interests, which is why it was particularly profound and deeply troubling when 3 U.S. service members were killed in January's Iranian-backed terror attack. I will keep saying this because it's true. Every dollar this administration gives to Iran is another dollar that will be used against our sons and daughters and puts them in harm's way in the military. Thankfully, the Treasury Department has the ability to stop the dollars moving around our global economy that bolsters the Iranian regime. However, this White House has reduced those barriers through so-called electricity waivers with expanded currency access to euros licenses and further billion-dollar payouts, going even so far as to give a lifeline to Nicolas Maduro's corrupt regime in Venezuela, a known ally of Iran, China, Russia, and Cuba, an axis of terror through broad oil and gas sanctions relief, of which we have seen no benefit to U.S. national security or to the Venezuelan people who suffer under Maduro. This is beyond troubling, especially when our service members are killed in terror attacks by Iranian proxies and our families here at home are struggling to put food on the table. When we look here at home, there's not a single neighborhood, whether that's Charleston, South Carolina, or Cleveland, Ohio, that has escaped the death grip of fentanyl. I'm very proud of this committee's work to address this crisis and for the support of all the members of this committee working together to stop this deadly drug. Because what fentanyl produced and trafficked by Mexican cartels and supported through Chinese precursors has done to our communities is a national security crisis. I remain committed to seeing this legislation passed into law and to stop the flow of illicit money and drugs across our border. Every family in America deserves to be free from the scourge of this deadly drug. I started with these 2 issues because I believe they should be top of mind for this administration and for this committee. And yet, just last week, Secretary Yellen was in China to discuss how cheap Chinese exports of green energy technology are harming electric vehicles and solar energy here in the United States. This is a clear climate goal of this administration, but far from the top goal we should be pushing back China on. A perspective that's frankly hard to stomach when Hamas is enabled by support from Iran to carry out horrific attacks against our ally, Israel, all while China continues to be the top purchaser of Iranian oil and top financier to international web of illicit financing used by the Mexican cartels to kill people using fentanyl. This needs to stop. Saving lives cannot play second fiddle to progressive climate goals. We need to see real efforts by China to stop these activities that undermine U.S. national security interests. America must be a strong leader. Fentanyl and terrorism are leading threats and should be treated as such. American families deserve to know that their government is protecting them from these threats and punishing those who trouble us. Thank you. Thank you for holding this hearing. I look forward to the opportunity to question
Thank you, Senator Scott. I'll introduce today's witness, the Honorable.
us this morning. I'll take a very different tack than Senator Kane on our support of our allies. I mean, one of the challenges I see around the country, around the world right now, is that it seems like the world is on fire, in part because of the weakness of our administration, the Biden administration. You think about the fact that China stares across the Taiwan Straits, or the Kremlin sets its sights further west, or Iran comes out of the shadows and starts attacking our strongest ally in the Middle East, Israel. You think about the fact that in the Sahel terrorism seems to be spreading faster than ever before. And to me, it just seems very clear that without question, the weakness of this administration emboldens our adversaries. And frankly, if there should be no daylight between Israel and America, it seems like there is a lot of daylight. The more decisions that are made from the administration to withhold shipments of weapons, the more challenges that we have. And frankly, if we're concerned about saving innocent lives, it seems like to me we would provide the resources that make dumb bombs smart by having the precision technology that has been held up on tarmacs and frankly in shipping the weapons. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on how it is in Israel's best interest and our relationship with Israel and that best interest that we hold back not just the shipments of the weapons, but the very precision technology that's necessary to turn these bombs into clearly better weapons and reduces casualties.
Well, Senator, first and very quickly, it won't surprise you that I disagree with your overall judgment.
What doesn't surprise me at all. You're right.
When it comes to China and Taiwan, we've brought countries around the world together to stand up for maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, to make sure that China does not engage in any unilateral actions that change the status quo. And China is hearing that from country after country, in no small measure because of our own engagement, our own diplomacy. When it comes to Russia and Ukraine, we've rallied.
Let's have a little just a dialogue on that. Here's one of the things I'd say in response to that. It's when you show weakness anywhere, it affects strength everywhere. When you have a botched Afghanistan challenge, when the president says that a small incursion in Ukraine might be acceptable, when he says to Putin that here's a list of areas not to cyber attack, the weakness in posture, I think, emboldens our adversaries. And so while you may be able to name some specific things that have been done, hopefully to reduce the impact, from my perspective, most of the world really respects strength, and that's about all they respect.
They respect strength and they respect wisdom. And what I'm seeing and hearing around the world is that we're demonstrating both. We've made major investments in ourselves that have put us in very good standing around the world, particularly in the competition with China as well as with Russia in different ways. We've managed to rally 50 countries in Ukraine's defense, prevented Russia from erasing Ukraine from the map, making sure that it has what it needs to defend itself, to stand up and even push back the Russian aggression. When it comes to Iran, which you mentioned as well, and I mentioned this, I think maybe, Senator, before you were in the room, when Iran engaged in an unprecedented attack on Israel, the first time that Iran had directly attacked Israel, for the very first time, the United States actively participated with our military in the defense of Israel. That had never happened before. We rallied other countries to Israel's defense. We thwarted what could have been a devastating attack, and I think the message was very clearly received in Iran, throughout the region, and around the world.
Let me ask you this question.
Please.
Part of the challenge that I see there is there's no doubt that the coalition that was available for the response, it was a strong one. I think part of that was because of the Abraham Accords. Normalizing relationships in the Middle East was actually impactful. So I thought to myself, this is strong to see the countries coming together in a coalition in defense. However, part of the challenge, of course, is that on October the 7th, the first thoughts that come out of the administration before they deleted it was to tell Israel to pause, is a challenge. The second thing is that you don't have to have a coalition defending Israel if there are no attacks from Iran. And so the fact of the matter is that the more we strengthen and embolden Iran by eliminating any of the hurdles being the sanctions, being allowing their oil to flow easier, the November decision to provide $10 billion, the August decision to provide $6 billion. The fact of the matter is that the 35% of the Iranian economy is driven by sale of energy. So the fact is that when we open that up, we're actually strengthening our adversary, not making them weaker.
In fact, Senator, not a single sanction has been lifted on Iran, and in fact, we've imposed sanctions.
Relaxing
on more than 500 Iranian individuals and entities. No. We haven't lifted a single sanction.
Well, I would say talk to Secretary Yellen about the conversation that we've had and that continues to be had about the fact that we're making it easier for Iran to sell their oil, which only increases their revenue, which then is used, 90% of it, to attack our allies.
Well, in the case of the $6 billion that you referenced,
Yes.
Iran has not accessed any of that. That was a channel that was established by the previous administration to find a
Then
secure way.
you're a
to
really
enable Iran
intelligent
to use
guy.
its
You're a
own
really
resources to
intelligent guy.
provide
The fact of the
free
matter is that
humanitarian
we all know that money is fungible. So let's not pretend that we don't know that. So you put a credit on a balance sheet. The bottom line is you should expect that credit to be used in any form or fashion that they decide to do so. So do you think our not having the IAEA Board of Governors censure Iran was a good thing or not?
It depends entirely on what we're trying to achieve and the best way to achieve it. More than unfortunately, one of the worst decisions made was to get out of the Iran nuclear agreement, which had put Iran's nuclear program in a box. Now we're dealing with a situation where the restraints that were imposed on Iran by that agreement gone away, and Iran has been proceeding whole hog toward developing the fissile material that it needs to produce nuclear weapons on very short order. We had breakout time pushed back beyond a year. Breakout time is now 2 to 3 weeks. So one of the critical things is, and we've lost access that we've had, one of the critical things is to make sure that the IAEA has
The chairman would
the access it needs.
allow a
to verify.
response.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
And
Yeah.
whether and what the most effective way at the IAEA is to get the access it has, and also to ensure that Iran is moving back on the steps that it's taken to enrich its material.
I'll just say this, that anyone who thinks that having a nuclear Iran is going to make them more peace-filled is ridiculous, number one. Number two, to suggest that somehow the JCPOA was the contract that stopped Iran from doing anything. In the midst of the JCPOA, they were already testing ballistic missiles. They had breached the JCPOA so many times that it was remarkable that we would even have a conversation about bringing that back into the conversation.
So
For us to have a conversation about the JCPOA and how bad it was, sure, to have a conversation about its effectiveness,
Let's look
I
at
think is remarkable.
where we were and where we are as a result of getting out of the JCPOA.
Here's
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
We were
I
not
appreciate
there.
the chance. Mr. Secretary, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. There's no greater responsibility that we have as public servants to make sure that we represent the interests of the American people and that we do it well, that we do it with character and with integrity. No greater responsibility. That responsibility starts here and now in addressing what your employees, Chairman Grunberg, describe as a hostile, abusive, and unprofessional workplace. And Chairman Brown, I think we actually need a single hearing solely focused on the concerns that the employees of the FDIC has with the leadership of Chairman Grunberg. Because the men and women of the FDIC working to safeguard our financial security deserve a healthy workplace. They deserve to be heard, to be seen. They deserve a safe and equitable workplace. But most of all, they deserve to be treated with respect. We've all seen the 200-plus pages of the special report. We all saw yesterday morning's grilling across the Capitol. And Marty, you've heard me say this to you directly. You should resign. Your employees do not have confidence in you. And this is not a single incident. This spans over a decade plus of your leadership at the FDIC. So I don't need to go into your failures and the complete lack of management while you've been at the FDIC. I want to talk about the people, your employees, and what they have done and what they have had to go through. How can you justify allowing supervisors to refer to to disabled veterans as Captain McNasty. We're talking about a veteran who lost part of his leg in service to our country. And to work in a hostile work environment where he is referred to as Captain McNasty is just not just wrong, but disgusting. To think about the chilling reports that say employees and supervisors were permitted to mock the fact that this employee used a wheelchair. What kind of environment and culture? And how long does it have to go on before it becomes commonplace to make fun, goad veterans who served this nation at great personal expense? Or when an employee reported that for a period of 3 years, a senior examiner would sexualize her every time he could. And he behaved similarly with other colleagues and bank employees, including asking to see photos of their daughters and whether or not those daughters were single. But it's not just your management team. You yourself set the example when you were absolutely irate and attacked your employee. Or another FDIC employee stating that they had a meeting with you and it was awful and felt very personal, that employees are made to cry as if it's some badge of honor making your employees cry. And people, after person wanting to quit. Others described your conduct as embarrassing and inappropriate. And one person said they'll likely be demoted. And if this is what it takes, they're out. One thing I learned from running my own business is that if you don't take care of your employees, they can't take care of the customer. And the customers of the FDIC, they are the American people. Mr. Grunberg, during your hearing yesterday, you stated that it doesn't matter if you believe that you can change the FDIC's culture. It matters if the employees believe that you can change the FDIC culture. They don't. Whistleblower after whistleblower, employee after employee have drawn the same conclusion. I would like to submit for the record a statement, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to submit for the record a statement from a collection of FDIC whistleblowers expressing their lack of confidence in Mr. Grunberg's ability to change the toxicity of the agency and their doubt that he is the right man for the job.
Without objection.
Leadership carries with it the responsibility of stewardship. Your sheep are lost and your fields riddled with weeds. In 2021, President Biden warned his staff, if you're ever working with me and I hear you treat another with disrespect, I promise I will fire you on the spot. And he did. He fired the Inspector General, Martin Dickman, of the U.S. Railroad Retirement Board for evidence that he created a toxic work environment and engaged in abusive treatment, including using crude and inappropriate language like slurs and belittling employees. I know I'm out of time. And the FDIC, in their special report, described you as harsh, aggressive, and interacting with your staff in a demeaning and inappropriate manner, having a temper and causing employees to feel disrespected, disparaged, and verbally attacked. I can only conclude with one question. What makes you so different than the Inspector General? Is it politics? Is it the fact that you are a necessary and easy vote for the Biden administration's economic policy agenda? I think the answer is yes.
Thanks, Senator Scott. Thank you for your remarks. I think we can agree that no public employee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Chopra, as I'm sure you heard during my opening comments, the CFPB's civil investigative demand, or CID process, is a prime example of your agency's vast attempts at regulatory overreach in an effort to chase obscure objectives and pet interests. A company, a small business, subject to one of your CIDs can spend years and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, attempting to comply with never-ending CFPB demands. Adding insult to injury, a company subject to CID compliance can be left hopeless for change, since any appeal is ultimately described and determined by you, the judge, and the jury. In fact, under your leadership, all CID appeal requests have been denied. And just a few months ago, you eliminated the role of the Associate Director of the Division of Supervision, giving yourself even greater control over all appeal decisions. How many CIDs has the CFPB issued under your leadership?
So let me say up top that enforcing the law doesn't just protect consumers, it protects honest businesses.
How many CIDs?
And let me just also correct that that's not true.
How many have you?
I don't have the exact number.
10, 50,
well, we have
500?
During my time as director, we've, I think, recovered around $8 billion. So that's been a lot of enforcement actions.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that you've been.
Senator, I have
no doubt about
I would be eager to meet with you. I would like to really discuss this with you. Our enforcement program has shifted away from small actors to large repeat offenders.
Well, frankly,
there's certainly the need to use civil investigative
I would
demands.
love to see your process work, but it's like having a bully in a school that keeps beating on
This is
the
how
same
every
kid.
other agency works as well.
Actually,
So,
you're the one agency is the one agency that does not flow through Congress.
That's also not true. Most other
do not.
financial
Actually, it goes to the
regulatory
Federal Reserve.
agencies do that.
The bottom
So
line
we
is
are going
simply
to
this,
keep
that
doing
you
our
have
enforcement work.
consistently abused your power.
That is
Frankly,
totally
I asked
not
you a
true,
specific
Senator.
question as it relates to the CIDs, and I get no answer. So let me go on to a different question, because I like the marketing strategy from the Biden administration as it relates to junk fees, because frankly, if you say the word junk fees, you assume that those junk fees are just unnecessary. I'm not sure that the average business person and or the consumer would see the late fees, the overdraft fees, and non-sufficient fund fees as junk fees. There's no question that the Biden administration has done a fabulous job of trying to highlight and market to the American people that these fees are unnecessary. Well, you said it's $10 billion. I'll take your word on that. The bottom line is simply this, that as a business functions, if you do not collect those fees from people who are delinquent on their payments, then you find those fees someplace else. So the fee structure may go away, but the revenues must be replaced by something else. And they're consistently replaced by either higher interest rates on credit cards or higher fees on accounts, or the elimination of those accounts, because if you can't find the revenues to maintain profitability from that sector of your business, what you essentially do is you eliminate them. Having been in business for 20 plus years, I can tell you that the bottom line is a simple one, that if your lowest performing consumers aren't incentivized to continue to perform better, you typically stop offering those products and services to those consumers. And when that happens, they don't just stop asking for the resources, they go to a different market where the interest rates are higher and or where there is no regulation whatsoever. Why are late fees okay for government agencies like the IRS, but not okay for businesses?
Well, so there's a congressional ban on unreasonable credit card penalties. And when the rules were implemented over a decade ago, there was a loophole which the credit card industry's lawyers have just driven a truck through to the tune of $10 billion a year. I think junk fees are a huge problem in our economy. I think it's one that is bipartisan in nature in terms of reform. People are really sick and tired of not seeing the full cost up front, but rather being nickeled and dimed on the back end. The thing about capitalism that's great, when you can compare the prices clearly, the best offerer will win out. But when you make the pricing so complex and convoluted, that's not good for the honest businesses. And frankly, our smaller banks and credit unions don't build a business model off of this loophole, and we should be doing more to support them, I think.
I would simply say that speaking with forked tongue is common in the Biden administration, number one. Number two, I would simply say this, as my time is running out, according to the chairman's red button. I wish we had congressional bans on the IRS charging late fees and interest on balances due. I wish we had a consistent standard applied to the public sector as we do the private sector. We'd probably have a better outcomes.
We should work on that together.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator. Senator Scott of South Carolina, ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, thank you for being here. Certainly, you and I would probably agree on one thing for sure, which is that the United States and a strong United States is a vital part of global security. And one of the challenges I have, as I started my opening statement with, is relates to the Iranian regime's proxy attacks on our American soldiers, is the fact that this administration, under your leadership in the Treasury Department, has released $6 billion before the October 7th attack, $10 billion after the October attack, and $100+ billion as relates to the relaxation of the oil sanctions. And that, to me, leads to attacks from the Houthis. It actually is in part because this administration downgraded the Houthis from a terrorist organization, foreign terrorist organization. So when I look at the actions of this administration and I couple that with the resources released to Iran, the question I ask is, how do you continue to provide Iran with billions of dollars, knowing that they are the ones that are orchestrating attacks against our service members? And I assume your answer will in part be that some of those dollars are frozen, even though there have been a couple of opportunities and acts trying to access those resources. But we both understand the fungible nature of money. And so I'd love to hear your answer, number one. Number two, likely, because I've spoken with you before during these hearings, you are very, very good, and therefore I may have to cut you off.
Okay. So first of all, I want to say that the Treasury Department has been extremely aggressive and very vigilant about sanctions on the Iranian regime. We have worked very hard and had many sanctions actions addressed at Iranian oil shipments to try to do what we can to minimize revenues from oil. We have taken many actions in the aftermath of the attacks on Israel to close down channels for Hamas and other Iranian-affiliated groups to use the financial system to fund their malicious activities. So I think the record is clear. We've done a great deal. With respect to
Let me stop
the
there,
funds,
because I do think you and I will not get to an agreement there. I do think that the record is clear that when you look at it, the net effect of the administration's actions has been more resources, more money for Iran, not fewer dollars. But I have two other subjects I want to cover with you. Go ahead.
could I just
Certainly.
quickly, the $6 billion that you're referring to were Iranian funds that were frozen in Korea. And
Yes.
we permitted these funds to be transferred to Qatar. They can only, when they were in Korea and now, can only be used for humanitarian purposes. And there are strict controls to make sure that they are directed only at humanitarian purposes.
Thank you. Let me
and
just
not
stop you there.
$1.
Mostly
None of it
because
is
I have
spent.
very little time left, and the chairman is being very tough on us today. as it relates to our time. So I will just respond by simply saying that if you give me $600 and I had a need, I would just use other money to deal with the need if you are trying to restrict the dollars. That's why I started the conversation with the fungible nature of dollars. But we do have another issue as it relates to the FSOC designations, the SIFI designations under FSOC. Under your direction, FSOC finalized guidance on a framework to evaluate non-bank financial firms for designation as a threat to our financial stability. If a company meets FSOC's new framework, it would be designated a SIFI and would be subject to Federal Reserve supervision and regulation. In 2019, FSOC issued a common sense proposal on this matter that evaluated firms based on their business activities, required a consideration of the firm's financial health, and perhaps most importantly, would have required the government to conduct a cost-benefit analysis prior to making any such designation. And recently, my understanding is that the way that you've restructured it, that no longer is the cost-benefit analysis necessary. No longer do you use the activities-based approach. Instead, due to, as I quote, unpredictability of the financial crises, such an analysis is not reasonably estimable, useful, or warranted in this context. So when you eliminate actual standards that people can understand and you go to something far more flexible and subjective, I think it makes it even more difficult for companies to figure out when they are in threat and when they are not in threat of becoming a SIFI.
I don't know if I have time to answer this question.
The chairman likes you.
Take your time on your answer. No, the answer is proceed.
We revised the 2019 guidance because it made it all but impossible to designate a firm as a SIFI and deprived FSOC of a tool that Congress in Dodd-Frank clearly intended for it to have. Dodd-Frank does not require a cost-benefit analysis. It could have required it. It chose not to require it, and for very good reason. And you just cited the reason, which is we're talking about some cost to an individual firm, and the benefit is a reduced probability of a devastating financial crisis like the one we had in 2008 that can deprive millions and millions of hardworking Americans and businesses of their livelihoods. And to try to assign a number to what that benefit is, even now, if you ask researchers what was the cost of the 2008 financial crisis, it was obviously huge, but to try to put a number on it is an artificial exercise, and it's clear that Dodd-Frank did not intend it. And with respect to an activities-based approach, the 2019 guidance said that there was a preference for an activities-based approach, and designation could only be used if an activities-based approach would not work.
Thank you.
And there is no preference here for designation. It is not a preferred approach.
I certainly think of you as an expert at saying a lot, but let me just suggest that only the government thinks that figuring out the cost of something is unnecessary and determining the activities that lead to the threat is unnecessary. That, from a business person's perspective, is remarkable.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator.
To housing affordability has been a one-size-fits-all, focused on subsidies that actually increase demand for housing, despite billions of dollars being spent through the American Rescue Plan and the so-called Inflation, makes me laugh every time I say that, Reduction Act. The cost of housing, like the cost of living, has only increased. It's time for a new approach, one that actually deals with the underlying challenges faced by individuals and our housing market more broadly. By legislation, the Road to Housing Act makes targeted reforms to start addressing these issues. Mr. Anthony, could you speak to some of the benefits of targeted reforms like the Road to Housing Act, as well as but talk about how that could increase supply, encourage competition, and frankly, reduce the regulatory burdens that we see today.
I'd be happy to, Senator. Thank you for the opportunity. One of the things that we often focus on when we're talking about trying to solve the housing affordability crisis is to increase demand, except that ends up making the problem worse. If we just have an exercise for a moment here, imagine we gave every renter in the country an extra $100 that they could only use towards their rent. What would happen? Well, landlords would simply just all raise their rent by $100 a month. And so that's essentially what we typically see in a lot of these federal programs that aim to make life easier. They're very well-intentioned programs, and they aim to make life better and make housing more affordable for renters, but instead they end up doing exactly the opposite. They end up increasing costs, not decreasing them. And so things that focus more so on improving supply as opposed to just simply increasing demand have a much better track record. Likewise, if you can give more flexibility in terms of options that regulators have at their disposal so that federal money can be targeted in different ways, in other words, allocated more efficiently, that also seems to have very good results. So doing things like expanding the definition of the kinds of dwellings that would qualify for certain types of subsidies is a very good move in the right direction. Likewise, anything you can do to broadly speaking, increase the financial literacy of those who are poorly off today has an incredible improvement on their quality of life. And the reason for that is because the same characteristics that have typically gotten them into the financial situation which they are today are also going to impede them from advancing further and also impede them from wisely using resources which the federal government or others put at their disposal. I mean, it's largely the same reason why so many people who win the lottery, let's say, or so many NFL superstars end up broke only a few years after they receive millions of dollars, because they simply don't know how to manage their money. They don't understand things like the costs that go into owning a home and everything that entails. And so regulatory flexibility is a tremendous help. Financial literacy is also a tremendous help as well.
Well, you raise an important question about financial literacy, and I think that we hopefully we all can share the importance, share in understanding and appreciating and agreeing, frankly, of the importance of financial literacy, period. I'd say, however, that in the current environment, looking at President Biden's recent State of the Union, he repeatedly claimed that his economic agenda was working for the average person in our country. But since he's taken office, mortgage rates have ballooned by 150%. 150%. Rent is up 20%. Homelessness in a single year increased by 12%. I think it's a fair assessment to say that the Biden policies are devastating and negatively impacting first-time home buyers. Would you agree with the time that we have left, about 45 seconds?
I would, Senator, and frankly, it's shocking how, if you follow the chain of events, you can see how trillions of dollars of government spending led to so many of the problems that we face today. It caused the inflation, it caused the violent change in interest rates which helped freeze over both the supply of new homes as well as the supply of existing homes to the market, and that has greatly contributed to the increase in prices that we have seen today.
Thank you. I yield back my 13
Thanks,
seconds.
Senator Scott. Happily, thank you.
You're welcome.
Happily. Senator Menendez of New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being with us today. At last week's hearing, we heard from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that the high prices Americans are paying as they struggle to put food on the table and face mounting debt are the result of greedflation and shrinkflation. And today, it's a similar story. This time, the boogeyman is so-called junk fees, and these fees are to blame for the obvious economic pain Americans are feeling. Not skyrocketing inflation, not increasing global instability, and certainly not the slush fund known as the Inflation Reduction Act. Clearly, there is no shortage of finger pointing for the failure of Bidenomics, or as I like to call it, brokenomics, because that's what's happening to the average American family. My Democratic colleagues and this administration have deployed a herd of scapegoats to deflect blame for the economic harm they have brought upon American households. Instead of taking responsibility for the real consequences of unchecked spending and increased regulation across the economy, the Biden administration would rather throw a towel over the mirror and say, "Not me." Sure, it might be easy or even politically expedient to slap a label of junk or excessive on additional costs for legitimate products and services in an effort to villainize business in America so that they themselves do not have to face the reality that Bidenomics, brokenomics, is causing devastation after devastation after devastation upon the shoulders of the American people. But it is long past time that Democrats stop playing political games with price controls and trying to micromanage the business operations, especially when the real outcome of these feel-good games is reducing access to credit and limiting economic opportunity for those who need it most. That's why I introduced a CRA resolution to overturn the CFPB's credit card penalty fee rule. Let's be clear about what this rule will mean for American families. It will result in lower credit limits and higher interest rates for borrowers. It will result in new fees for services that are currently provided free of charge. Finally, and perhaps worst of all, this rule will cut off access to credit and stymie financial inclusion for the families who need it most. Sadly, I wasn't surprised when the CFPB finalized the credit card penalty fee just days before the President's State of the Union address. That's the politics of this administration. Actions that sound good as talking points, just like the billions of dollars of student loan forgiveness, but they are truly divorced from economic reality. And it's not just the financial sector, it's everything, everywhere, all at once. That's what astounds me. This administration's rhetorical hypocrisy. The White House has claimed that a junk fee is a charge designed either to confuse or deceive consumers. Ironically enough, two of the recent targets within the committee's jurisdiction, overdraft and credit card late fees, are two of the most highly regulated and transparent business practices in any industry. The credit card late fees and overdraft fees we are discussing here today are in fact not illegal and are heavily regulated. And while we are on the subject of regulation, if Democrats actually wanted to address the junk fees that American families are facing, a good place to start would be the enormous costs that consumers are paying due to the Biden administration's regulatory onslaught. It's an albatross around every family trying to make ends meet. Since he took office, the total cost of President Biden's regulatory nightmare, the mountain of red tape, is $1.37 trillion. That's $1.37 trillion, T as in Tom, dollars, paid by everyday families in the form of higher prices because of these new regulations. This contributes to the increased cost for food, housing, vehicles, and all the other basics a family must have just to survive. And this happens while inflation is raging. If my friends on the other side of the aisle were truly interested in helping the American family, the American people, this hearing would be about finding solutions to tame the inflation that has increased the cost of goods by almost 20% since President Biden took office. We should be discussing how real average hourly wages have decreased under this administration. Remember, 52 paychecks in a row where inflation was higher than wage increase. And we would be discussing how President Biden has promised to let the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, expire next year, which would result in a $2.5 trillion tax increase on the American family. But that's not the conversation we're having today, unfortunately. In closing, it is my hope that we will hear today how misguided the administration's attempts are to push the financial services industry into only offering a one-size-fits-all products when we should be really focusing on providing solutions to the financial hardships facing Americans. And let me just close with one example. Everyone I know hates paying a late fee. But the late fee is oftentimes the one thing that encourages us to take our bills more seriously. Because ultimately, a late fee represents a late payment. And if you are late on your payment, ultimately, your credit score goes down, which means that the cost of borrowing goes up, undeniably. If we really want to save Americans more money, we should focus not on these fees that encourages better payment history so your credit score goes up and your interest rates go down. We should focus on the cost of gas up 40%. We should focus on the cost of energy up 30%. We should focus on the cost of food up 20%, not on late fees.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Three witnesses.
Thank you, Commissioner Goldsmith-Romero. Thank you once again for the conversation we had. And I told you then I was going to ask you these questions, so they're not a surprise to you whatsoever, give you an opportunity to deal with some of the challenges. Unlike the chairman who suggests the only reason to vote against someone in this committee is because of partisan reasons. That's just hogwash, to be blunt. The truth is that the whistleblower complaints, and I think the whistleblowers would actually disagree with the chairman's comments as well, whistleblower complaints suggest that the same challenges that we see at the FDIC under Grunberg, some of those same challenges exist with SIGTAR under your leadership. And so my question to you is, how would you respond to some of the challenges that we've talked about in my office?
Thank you, Senator. I really do appreciate the time to address this. I absolutely disagree. There's nothing like what was in the Cleary report at the FDIC. We had, and I was very glad to have this, a very independent and fair process that employees could go to and they felt safe going to, and they did. And I'm glad they did, because then as management, we could see what the issues were that we had to address. We never had any women complaining about sexual harassment. We never had these issues of retaliation. I was responsible. If there had been discrimination, harassment, retaliation, I would have taken it seriously and dealt with it right away. The findings were, and I have to respect the process, but also the outcome. In 11 years, there was only one finding against the agency. It was early on in my tenure, and I took it very seriously and addressed it. I'll also say that all IGs and their senior staff are held to a very, very high standard because we fall under the oversight of SIGI. And so SIGI has an integrity committee that will do reports and investigations on IGs, and they never had any findings. But even without having discrimination or retaliation or harassment, what I can tell you is that I still cared about employee morale and trying to have employees feel supported and trying to, we just created this environment of high dignity and professionalism and respect so that employees could bring their best selves to work and work like a team, and the senior staff shared those same values. And I believe that's reflected in the great success that SIGTARP had. We were a very small agency and compared to the mission that we had to take on. So everyone was pulling together, and we were able to have that success and protect the financial system. So that's why I want to go to the FDIC and do the same thing there.
Can you confirm for me that you've had no complaints filed against you specifically for discrimination, harassment, or retaliation?
Senator, I think it would be very normal to name me in any kind of complaints, and I would welcome that because I'm ultimately the one responsible for changing things and fixing things right away. So the buck stops with me. And so I would be named, that would be a very normal thing to name all the managers all the way up. But in my 11 years, we only had this one finding early on.
I'm certainly familiar with the concept that there are three sides to every story: yours, mine, and the truth. And so I certainly appreciate you answering that question. In my office, we also talked about the importance of trying to find a way for the employees, especially at the FDIC and beyond, that have had challenges within the organization to be able to go forward with complaints, but not go forward with complaints. And the same with organization that actually manages. So under Chair Grubenberg, has a recent proposal creating the FDIC's Office of Professional Conduct and Office of Equal Employment Opportunity. Of course, the challenge is that all those reports, complaints, and concerns come straight back to the chair. How would you create a culture where the person who is handling the complaints isn't a part of the organization itself?
Thank you, Senator. I really do appreciate that you and I had some time to talk about the importance of it having an independent and fair process. So in the federal government, the EEOC sets that up. There's various agencies for different kinds of allegations, but the EEOC sets that up and works with the agencies to do that in a way where the investigations can be investigated so that there's no influence on the fact finder. These are the types of things that are important, that independence.
Do you have state supervisory experience?
So, Senator, I have worked a lot with the state banking regulators, quite a bit. In fact, Pierce Bank in Washington, we were able to go in with the state banking regulators for years that we did, working hand in hand. We ultimately found why the bank failed, uncovered the cause of it, and then we brought significant convictions in that case. I believe 15 bankers who were convicted. We were working hand in hand with the state banking regulators.
So you do believe that your nomination comports with the FDI Act?
Are you talking about to have the banking
please.
super? So I'm not. If the way it's written, I understand the issue there. I believe if the way it's written is that someone who has to have worked in a state banking regulator, I have not done that. I've just worked with the state banking regulators. That was just one example.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Senator Scott. Senator Smith of Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Chair Brown. And Ranking
Senator Scott,
Thank you, sir. Thank
the
you all.
newly wedded Senator Scott.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Extending my time beyond the 5 minutes in order to respond to the statement about me being newly married, I will say that this ring here weighs more than it appears to weigh. It's a weighted responsibility. It's a great sign, actually, because in fact, you take up the marriage process and ceremony, the wedding itself, and you come to the conclusion that it's a weighty responsibility, and I thank God Almighty that I've had the opportunity to engage in it at 58 years young. So it'll take me a little while to get to my 50th anniversary, but that's okay by me. I'll be 108 years old. Thank you so much, Senator Warnock. It's a simple concept. You take out a loan, you pay it back. I'm not sure where the confusion is on that. Frankly, I think the cost of higher education may be debatable, whether it's good or bad, but one thing is without question, the ROI on your college education is pretty darn strong in America. And frankly, the desire to see colleges move towards free, interesting concept. You look at states like Tennessee, where you can get your first 2 years of college free at their local college community schools, and those assets or those credits transfers to the four-year schools. In South Carolina, if you go to some of our local community colleges, those credits transfers to Clemson and or Carolina or to other public schools in the state. That's an easy way for states to do what I believe is a state and local responsibility, manage the resources within their states, not put that onus on the backs of the federal government. Ms. Akers, thoughts?
I tend to agree with you. The average net cost of enrollment at community college is negative based on the existing subsidies to higher education at this point. I think that, in fact, the ROI is on average very large and positive. So, in fact, people who get in and go through college and finish their degree are getting a fantastic deal. Not to say we shouldn't have safeguards for people who borrow and don't get that return, but on average, the system should work well if we were supporting it with policies that, in fact, we're buying into the idea that we would have a lending program in place.
The low delinquency rate for private loans, less than 4% compared to over 12% for federal loans, demonstrates their effective role in managing financial risk. Do you agree with that statement? And would you?
Yeah, so part of the
Take it
problem with
goodbye.
the federal student loan program is that by design, there is no underwriting that takes place. What that means is that we have decided that we're going to make everyone eligible for the same amount of credit, regardless of their prospects of being able to pay in the future. The advantages that private student loans have is that, in fact, they don't make this decision. So it's the underwriting that ensures that these loans are, in fact, affordable. We haven't done that. And if there is a predatory lender in this space, I think there's an argument to be made that it's the federal government.
Thank you. Another question for you, Ms. Akers. Wouldn't it make more sense for us to focus on comprehensive reforms like improving financial aid transparency, scaling back federal lending programs, and promoting accountability among colleges to prevent runaway tuition costs?
Absolutely. I feel like we are at a point today where we have dissolved the functioning of the program because of all of the incremental reform. We're overdue for a reauthorization of the Higher Education Act that should basically refine, simplify the program, put in place a single lending program, tough accountability standards on colleges, maybe even an expansion of the Pell Grant program, but basically reinvest in this idea that people are borrowing to be able to make investments in themselves that they can pay back to taxpayers in the future.
One of the, I think it was 2010, when Congress passed legislation that capped a borrower on the public student loans at 10% of their income, based on that 10% cap plus I think it was a 15-year or 20-year ultimate repayment window. The fact of the matter is that already in existence is a system where the average borrower will likely not pay back what they've borrowed. That unpaid balance doesn't just disappear like magic. It actually goes on the backs and the shoulders of other folks.
In fact, I think it's a misnomer to talk about student loan forgiveness or student loan cancellation. In fact, we should be using the terminology that this is a transfer of debt to taxpayers who are now on the hook to pay for these unpaid balances.
The way I look at it, and I've said this several times, that I'm the first college graduate in my family, and I thank God that I've had the opportunity to go to college and to graduate. Think about the whole student loan debacle brought to us by the Biden administration of recent, trying to cancel $1 trillion worth of student loan debt. The one thing I keep asking myself, why is it okay for my mother, who never made more than $20 an hour, to be responsible to carry a part of the burden for people who make six figures annual salaries? I don't understand the fundamental unfairness of transferring to someone something they never signed for and transferring away from someone that they actually signed up for.
I think that's absolutely the case, and probably my fellow witnesses here at the table would be quick to point out that not everybody who's gone to college is in fact in that position of financial privilege, but it's worth revisiting what you just put on the table, that in fact there were existing programs that ensured that anybody who had a student loan 10 years ago that was unaffordable to them did not have to repay it. So in fact, there was fairness in the previous system. I would argue and agree with you today that we are moving away from fairness.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to start by reminding this room and our witnesses of the important role they play in safeguarding our nation's economic and national security priorities. President Reagan once rightly noted that we are in a different world, and our defenses must be based on recognition and awareness to combat our enemies of the modern day. While he was talking about the Soviets, unfortunately, many of our adversaries remain the same: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. But thankfully, what also remains the same is the American spirit to innovate and to create the world's leading technologies. My home state of South Carolina is an excellent example. From F-16s to the world's best luxury airliners, to leading automotive manufacturing, to creating next generation technologies, I'd say South Carolina is simply our future. But to safeguard that future, we must ensure that policies created here in Washington don't cut off growth and stifle future innovation. We must have a global economy where America is the leader. After more than 3 years of President Biden's policies, we have seen soaring inflation that is crushing everyday Americans. wars across our globe, and our enemies challenging us and our allies at every single turn. We can and we must, frankly, do better. So today, as we discuss and evaluate some of our economic national security tools, our export controls, investment security, and the Defense Production Act, we must keep these principles in mind. At times, we must be willing to reassess our policies and retool our positions. And frankly, let's consider our allies. One thing we certainly learned through COVID was depending on China is a really bad strategy. To be effective in countering China, we must work with our allies so that China cannot easily find workarounds to our U.S. export controls by simply buying these same technologies and equipment from our friends. A failure to look holistically at our economic strategy can and will damage American security, competitiveness, and unfairly leave U.S.-led industry behind. In fact, a recent study by the New York Federal Reserve found that the Biden administration's export control policies on the semiconductor industry have led to decreased profitability, job losses, and $130 billion in financial loss across the industry. With new reports that these types of policies have directly led to thousands of layoffs in states ranging from Ohio to New York, we must scrutinize the actions leading to these results. But it doesn't stop there. In my home state of South Carolina, recent actions by the Commerce Department to revoke thousands of export licenses for gun manufacturers have resulted in millions of dollars in losses. I've sent 3 letters to the Commerce Department on this issue, and now reports suggest that we will see over $500 million in annual losses across U.S. firearm manufacturers. Mr. Chairman, I have a letter here that I would like to submit for the record.
Objection, Sword.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In my home state of South Carolina, a small minority-owned firearms business had more than $71 million worth of export licenses revoked by the Biden Commerce Department. Unfortunately, this meant that the firm defaulted on multiple international contracts, and now those same contracts are being backfilled by China and others. And it is my understanding that these licenses were revoked for foreign policy reasons, such as furtherance of world peace. So instead of supporting American companies, we just handed over the marketplace to China. Export controls, investment security, and important tools like the Defense Production Act should be used in a responsible manner that maximizes growth here at home and economic pain for our adversaries. I strongly believe that when we have a better domestic environment, a better ability to innovate and manufacture, that means that America is winning. Thank you, and I look forward to discussing these important issues with our witnesses.
Senator Scott, the ranking member from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Kindler, I'm glad you're here. My colleagues and I have written several letters calling for your testimony and on Commerce Department's firearm export licensing policies and regulations, because unfortunately your policies appear to have all the signs of political targeting, costing the industry an estimated $500 million per year and generating no national security benefits. Case in point is the company I mentioned during my opening testimony, MG Super and Associates. I'm looking at some of the denials on these licenses, and the reason, fascinating, foreign policy pursuant to 22 CFR 120.18A1 and 2 of the ITAR, the Department of State may deny a license or other approval when the department deems such action to be in furtherance of world peace, denying a company the opportunity to sell firearms to the Ecuadorian police. Next one, same verbiage, deems it such action necessary to further world peace, denying, again, another license to sell to the Ecuadorian military. This minority business owner is Ecuadorian, cares a lot about safety in a country where his mother born and raised. Another one, furtherance of world peace. It is not only frustrating and exacerbating, but challenging to see this over and over and over and over again. Your firearm policy has resulted in over $71 million in licenses canceled for this company, meaning they've lost their contracts and they've lost the ability to support the police and the military across the Western Hemisphere. That does not mean that the Ecuadorian police did not find another channel. Of course, they went to Brazil, Czech Republic, and China to get these orders backfilled. You haven't prevented the sale of firearms. You've merely used a political tactic to harm an American business. What's even worse is that it, to me, appears to be political targeting. The International Trade Association, under your leadership, has stopped this company, but allowed competitors in some of our nation's poorest areas to not be able to effectively create jobs, not be able to effectively produce a world-class competitive product and have a market to sell it to, because you're trying to further world peace. Thoughts?
Senator, I really appreciate you bringing up this topic, and I'm
not sure you do, but I think this is an important topic that reinforces this administration's philosophical approach to trying to shut down or cut off gun manufacturing in our own country.
I do appreciate you bringing it up, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what we're trying to accomplish and what our rules have actually done. Our focus is on protecting national security, full stop. We tailored the rule. Our presumption of denial in this rule is tailored to ensure that U.S. lawfully exported firearms don't end up in the hands of criminals, gangs, cartels, terrorists.
May I ask you a question there? Is there evidence that his company's firearms sold to the military and to the police have not been received by the military or police? Is there something specific about this transaction or the other three that were denied?
Senator, I'm not in a position to speak to a specific company's situation, but I certainly feel sorry for your constituent, and I'd like to follow up with you in an environment where we can talk about a specific company. But let me be clear, our presumption of denial, it only applies to non-government entities in the 36 countries designated by state as high risk. So if these transactions are with government entities, that is not the subject of our presumption of denial.
Thank you. Let me just say, I think words mean things. Ecuadorian police, Ecuadorian military, Colombian military.
Ranking Member Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today, all the witnesses. First and foremost, I want to start today by thanking our law enforcement partners at the state and the federal level. Every day, our law enforcement members work tirelessly to combat crime, including financial crime, and to protect and defend victims in every community around the country. And that's exactly what the frauds and scams are. They are crimes. And the criminals who commit these crimes should be punished accordingly. I also want to acknowledge our regulators, both at the state and the federal level, as well as our financial institutions and companies that work tirelessly to combat and prevent criminal actors from taking advantage of hardworking Americans. This includes their critical work in educating consumers on the warning signs of popular frauds and scams. The first step to stopping fraud is ensuring people are equipped with the tools to recognize the very fraud that so many of us fall victim to. Criminals are inherently looking to benefit themselves without regard for the well-being of others, and certainly without respect of the law. And unfortunately, criminals often prey on our most vulnerable, which of course would be our seniors. Unfortunately, it seems almost daily that I hear a horrible story of hardworking Americans who worked their entire lives forced to come out of retirement after having their scams and their savings wiped out by the scams. My time as ranking member of the Aging Committee allowed me to learn a great deal more about these types of crimes, in particular, the severe detriment they have on our nation's seniors. That is why I advocated to holding hearings directly focusing on these types of fraud and issued an annual fraud book to bring about more awareness of these scams. Today, I look forward to hearing from the panel of witnesses in front of us today so that we can understand the new and emerging solutions to fight this epidemic. And it is my hope that this will not simply turn into a blame game of who's responsible, whether it's the financial industries, whether it's the scammers. We need all hands on deck to solve the problem that we face today and help protect more Americans from the challenges that they have once their savings are gone. I believe, frankly, that part of the solution starts with education. And for my time in Congress, I've continued to promote financial education and financial literacy because those, as my top priorities, allows us to address the very challenges that so many Americans face. If we can help more Americans access financial education, we can help them have the tools to both protect themselves as well as achieve financial freedom. This is why I'm so pleased to have Carrie Grube Leibarker with us today. She's the administrator of the South Carolina Department of Consumer Affairs before us today, and she will share her perspective and some of the things you've been doing to help combat these challenges. I love this, ditch the pitch. Sometimes the fewer words you use, the more you actually say, the more effective you are communicating. And I will say in a world that is, unfortunately, moving at a faster pace, the longer we have to listen, sometimes the less we actually absorb. And so ditch the pitch gives us at home in South Carolina an opportunity to learn ways to reduce the impact of scams and frankly to detect them quickly and perhaps avoid them altogether. Our nation's seniors are not only the ones affected by these crimes, and these criminals are looking for new targets every single day. Criminals are unfortunately smart and agile. Just like we are working to use new technologies to drive efficiencies and choice, criminals are using new technologies to pad their own pockets at someone else's expense. That's why we must adapt and continually work to innovate. We must also work to educate and combat criminals using these same technologies for ill gain. And let's not forget what we heard in February when this committee examined check fraud. Old technologies are also being used to exploit in an increasing frequent manner. I'll close like I started. I'm grateful for the work of our law enforcement, our regulators, and our financial institutions, what they're doing together to combat and prevent financial crime. And I'm really proud of the good work being done to better educate people of all ages on the fraud and scams they face. Today, I hope we hear ideas on how we can improve our technology, our education, and our approaches to stopping these crimes, all the while making sure we are not incentivizing new or additional criminal acts. Thank you all.
Thanks, Senator Scott. I'll introduce today's witness tester. Senator Scott's recognized.
Thank you. Ms. Leibarker, once again, I want to thank you for representing our home state so well. Without any question, South Carolina continues to be a nationwide leader in financial literacy efforts, and I have been impressed by your ingenuity in those efforts when it comes to fraud and scam prevention. I was recently reading about your partnership with the South Carolina Department of Aging to once again deliver scam prevention and education materials to seniors alongside their meal delivery. I think that is brilliant. I mean, honestly, when we're having a meal delivered, if you're able to deliver information during that time, if I'm hungry, I'm going to read it. It's just the way my body works. So I think that is just a fantastic way of taking advantage of a positive opportunity to engage with our seniors, especially in a time where they're going to be more interested, perhaps. Can you share some insights from that program and others that your department has carried out over the years?
Sure, thank you so much. So with that particular partnership, it actually started when we initially released Ditch the Pitch back in 2015. At that point, it was Lieutenant Governor's Office on Aging, and they were gracious enough to put these on the meals. And it's folks not only that are usually in our senior population, but some that are homebound as well. And so they're likely not going to come out to a presentation or an event where we are. And so whenever we do outreach or create a publication or have some kind of campaign, we're looking to try and find those kind of pathways that we can get it into the hands of the folks who need it most. The Department on Aging is one of those. ARP is a great effort there. This Ditch the Pitch bingo that we have, we are part of a World Elder Abuse Task Force, and it's a group of 30 government and non-government agencies that all have some kind of touch point with the senior communities in South Carolina. It could be that they're continuing care retirement communities, or they provide in-home care services or things like that, and the Department on Aging is a part of that as well. But it allows us to network so we know each other's services, so when they are out and about as well, and here's something they can say, that's an issue Consumer Affairs can assist with, or you need a presentation on this topic, that's Consumer Affairs. And we're able to get the word out because we're only 47 full-time employees. And so leveraging those resources at all levels is very important.
For those who don't live in South Carolina, if you don't live in South Carolina, I really don't know why you don't, but in the end, 47 employees, really we have 46 counties. So it's literally one person per county if you look at it from that perspective. Right. That's a massive opportunity and responsibility. Opportunity to work more than 40 hours a week and the responsibility to engage with as many residents around our state as humanly possible. So we thank you very much for the work that you're already doing.
Thank you.
Let me ask you another question. Sometimes sitting here in Washington, it's easy to get stuck in the Beltway mindset and overlook many of the innovative ideas and solutions that are created within our states. I pride myself in thinking that my goal as a legislator, as an elected official, is not necessarily to be the origin of great ideas, but to be the conduit of great ideas. And it's one of the reasons why I love going home every weekend back to South Carolina to hear from my constituents and some experts and people who've just have real life experience on what the solution is to said problem. And I look at that from this same perspective when it comes to scams and frauds and dealing with some of the challenges that we face. One of the things that I think we have to do is make sure that we never lose hope that we will win this fight. I mean, time and time again, it feels like the more we see scams being successful, the less energy we have to fight them because we kind of feel like we've lost that fight. And that's never a strong position to respond from. So I refuse to believe that we have lost a fight. Mm-hmm. Are there lessons that we can learn from South Carolina to fight these criminals and prevent harmful scams? Can you please speak to some of the partnerships you have with financial institutions as well as law enforcement to educate, prevent, and combat such crimes?
Sure. So we are not territorial. I mean, we don't say this is our sandbox. We don't want others in it. We certainly invite others in on all levels. We're an agency that regulates non-depository financial institutions, and so we have relationships with folks who are dealing with consumers' monies and financial products in that way. So we'll partner with the South Carolina Bankers Association to do education for their members and other trade associations as well on the scams that we're seeing, because oftentimes it's not just consumer related. Businesses fall victim to scams as well, which ultimately impact the prices and the services that they're providing to those consumers. So making sure that we don't have blinders on to just stay in a certain lane and trying to be as broad as we can in our outreach. And with law enforcement, we partner with different sheriff's associations, the Police Chiefs Association. I just got a contact from Beaufort County where they were reaching out about a cryptocurrency ATM that was being used for some scams there. So having those relationships, building the relationships, and making sure that we're getting out to those members of our business communities to let them know what we're seeing, let them know what to watch out for, and again, that our services that are available and others of our partners too.
Mr. Chairman, I'll finish with this thought. Listening to the witnesses, one thing that comes to mind is that many of us as elected officials do some type of a teletown hall back in our states, and it seems like it would be helpful for us to have in our respective states a teletown hall that includes the AARP, whatever the iteration of your consumer financial agency is in each state, putting them together and then doing one extra step, which is looking at those folks who are homebound, perhaps who may be more vulnerable, because if you're there all the time, you're more likely and more inclined to pick up the phone, perhaps. If we were able to target those folks back at home to make sure that we are including them in a teletown hall, that might be a way for us to address these issues, and not just through legislation, but through information that we can disseminate from our elected official positions.
Good idea, Senator Scott.
Thank you. Now, I was talking in my opening statement, opening comments about the fact that the impact of inflation has driven the cost of construction to highest levels we've seen in the shortest period of time. I think about the Inflation Reduction Act that some continue to celebrate as somehow mitigating the impact on our country of inflation. Still, to me, a bit backwards. One program within that IRA is the Greenhouse Gas Fund that has to get $27 billion out the door by September the 30th. And the way I look at it, Dr. Getty's from an economist, you rush $30 billion, $27 billion out of the door in an already hot, artificially stimulated economy. Chances of it having a negative impact within the construction industry, I think, is pretty high, personally. I think the fact of the matter is that the COVID relief package, first bill passed by the Democrats, $1.9 trillion, the Inflation Reduction Act, the IIJA, the CHIPS Act, those resources flooding into the economy, some of it, not all of it immediately, only helped impact the inflation that the average American has been feeling. So from the macroeconomy perspective, the loss of spending power of the average American is around $28,000 cumulative over the last 3 years, 3.5 years. Can you please speak, Dr. Geddes, to the inflationary impacts regarding infrastructure specifically and its development because of the inflationary environment that we find ourselves in today?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I think it's two ways of approaching that. One would be from the macroeconomic theory that you mentioned, and you're stimulating demand in a highly supply-constrained environment. And the theory implies that is going to be inflationary. On the sort of empirical or statistical side, it's difficult to tease out the effects of a particular program on the overall inflation rate.
Yes.
But I think it's worth noting, maybe emphasizing a part of my testimony to your original statement about how inflation in this sector, in the heavy civil construction sector, is higher. There's a block quote that I have from The Economist in November 2023 that says, "The problem is that inflation has been rampant in the construction sector, making delays that much more pernicious. The single biggest component of the infrastructure package was a 50% increase in funding for highways to $350 billion over 5 years. But highway construction costs soared by more than 50% from the end of 2020 to the start of 2023, in effect wiping out that extra funding." So the purchasing power effects are being diminished or wiped out by the added spending, or added inflation. I added some more up-to-date numbers on concrete costs and so forth, and it's still higher than the Consumer Price Index.
I'll ask you a question about NEPA, but before I go there, I want to once again highlight programs that the government continues to provide resources for, but they never actually spend the resources that they provide. As an example, back in 2021, Congress approved $42 billion to help connect more Americans to the internet, basically. Looking at a tweet that I saw and found, at this point, it had been 987 days since the plan was enacted, and 0 Americans had been connected, 0 shovels worth of dirt had been turned, even though there had been $42 billion set aside for programs to help connect Americans. The challenge, of course, the government rewards itself based on its intentions, not based on the actions that follow those intentions. You mentioned the cumbersome process that NEPA creates for getting shovel-ready projects started.
Mm-hmm.
Would you expound for the rest of my time that I have?
Sure. So NEPA had, again, very good intentions. I believe when it was passed in 1970, it's grown over time. It's sort of a whole lot of things going on.
A web of confusion.
In NEPA, it's grown administratively, and it's now become an extremely serious barrier to rapid project delivery. We're seeing that kind of in green projects where there's environmental groups that would like those projects to get out quickly, but then they sort of run headlong into this cumbersome NEPA process. And I think it's time for reform. I should probably highlight this study that I have here that came out in the past few weeks by one of my heroes, Bob Poole at the Reason Foundation, surveyed other countries and how they do their NEPA processes. Just to highlight, we don't have time, but I could go across countries. Australia has a sort of a one-stop shop for its environmental review and permitting process called the Department of Climate Change, Energy and the Environment and Water, and they have strict time limits on how quickly their reviews of environmental permitting processes have to go, like 20 days for the first stage, 30 for the second. So it is really a time-constrained process that still respects the desire to preserve the environment, as Australians do, but it doesn't have to be as long as it is in the United States. And as we know, Senator, time really is money and infrastructure.
Absolutely.
If you delay a project, it always goes up in cost.
Thank you. Last point, and I'm running out of time here. I'd love for us to, I'll submit it for the records, questions about the public-private partnerships that actually reduces cost, extends long-term maintenance, and puts part of the onus on the private sector. Thank you.
Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being with us today, and thank you for the committee members who are here with us as well. One of the challenges I see on this conversation that we're having today is to realize that local problems need local solutions. It's really hard for folks in Washington, D.C. to understand the transit needs of folks in Charleston, South Carolina, Somerville, South Carolina, Columbus, Ohio, or Chicago, Illinois. The most effective thing that we can do is make sure that the resourcing goes without all the red tape and challenges that comes from Washington, D.C. Getting that done seems to be too close to Peter walking on the water. Nearly a miraculous occurrence and manifestation has to happen for us to just do the simple thing. I spent half my career in politics on the local level, understanding and appreciating transit systems, infrastructure projects, and what it takes to get those things done. When I first became a senator, the one thing I did was I decided that as a kid who grew up in a single-parent household, mired in poverty, who understood the transit needs of the poorest Americans trying to get to the job, I wanted to make sure that I was sensitive to the current state of Americans trying to get to work. So I decided I'd go back to the old bus routes and get on those bus routes and spend time talking to people waiting on the bus to come. I remember talking to a grandmother who worked at Walmart who wanted to spend more time with her grandkids on the weekends, but she would spend 80 to 90 minutes early in the morning waiting on the bus, 7 hours at work, and 80 or 90 minutes to get back home. 3 hours to work a 7-hour shift for slightly more than minimum wage to provide the resources necessary to help our grandkids have a better life and a better opportunity to experience and enjoy the American dream. Having the conversations with folks who are struggling to make ends meet, thinking about how challenging it is as a local official to understand and then to decide the right transit routes so that the folks who need public transportation have access to the right routes at the right times to get to the right job. You just can't do that from Washington. The one thing Washington has done poorly is to put on more onerous burdens on local government and state government because somehow 535 people in Washington seem to know everything about local needs, and yet we seem to know nothing about getting the job done. As an example, my friends on the left are always looking for a new green steel. They call it the new Green Deal, but in the end, it steals opportunity and innovation, and creativity, and resources from local folks to make good decisions about what they need. But it's not just transit, it's actually the infrastructure needs that are delayed time and time again. I was thinking about this recently, and it takes about 7 years for a project to turn the shovel on a new highway program. I was thinking about Highway 17 and its expansion in Mount Pleasant in South Carolina a number of years ago. The frustration I felt as the chairman of the county, waiting for all the red tape to be cut so that we could simply turn shovel on a project that had been approved for years. And I sent some notes to my friends back on county council just to make sure that I was right about the 7-year process. It could take up to 2 years for the planning and the programming just to meet federal thresholds so that projects can start. And then after you do that, it can take up to 3 years, whether it's NEPA or other environmental challenges. You throw the Green New Steel on top of all of that, and you recognize that this onerous burden to start a road project takes 7 years. Now here's the challenging part. When you get the price of a highway project, let's say those days was several $100 million, $700 million, right? It's not anticipated that 7 years later, somehow, some way, miraculously, that same road project is going to cost the same amount of money 7 years later. That's what we call in South Carolina ridiculous, hogwash. It just doesn't work that way. But none of that is anticipated in the actual price that people pay. Waiting and waiting and waiting for the federal government just do their jobs and get out the way. But then after you get through the environmental review and compliance, which is 3 years later, then you go to the preliminary and final design. Up to 2 more years on this process. And at the same time all of this is happening, currently under the Biden administration, everybody wants to celebrate the IIJA and the IRA, the most ridiculously named bill in maybe American history, the Inflation Reduction Act that actually increases inflation, and the CHIPS and Science Act. What happens? Well, the cost of construction explodes to the highest level ever. It costs more money to do the same thing than it has ever cost 3 or 4 years later. And so when you take a 7-year delay on a road, you take all the impact studies that it takes, we're not smart enough to do them all at the exact same time. We're going to wait for the first 2 years before we start the environmental impact studies, before we start if this was a business, we would just fire everybody. That's what I would do. That's what I did when I was in business. If it takes you 7 years to get something started, I want someone else in charge. Americans want someone else in charge because the $2 billion problem that they have in Maryland to rebuild a bridge that's going to take 4 years is ridiculous, unnecessary. All you need is common sense and people ready to go to work. And unfortunately, every time well-intentioned politicians make the decision that we know better than the local community, it costs jobs. It costs prices because they explode. I gotta tell you, 13 years on the local level is a really good education on what not to do. Let's not burden local government with the Green New Steel, that $7.5 billion in green funding that results in only 8 EV charging stations. That takes all those dollars away from being able to have real progress on real roads for real people to get to their jobs. Mr. Chairman, I'm glad we're having the hearing today. But I gotta tell you, most Americans would say, skip the hearing, block grant the money, and let a brother go to work. That's what they would say.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Scott from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair Powell, we've heard a steady stream of commentary that there will be changes to Basel III endgame proposal. That can be seen certainly as good news. Some reports say it could be finalized as soon as August. Others say you are circulating a term sheet for a revised proposal. Through it all, this proposal will have outsized impacts on our banking system, from big to regional to our U.S.-based foreign institutions, as well as impeding access to credit for consumers. So even though you yourself have said there will be broad and material changes, I believe this proposal is flawed, both in process and in substance, and should be withdrawn. Do you agree, and will you commit to withdrawing the existing proposal and issuing a new proposal with a robust notice and comment process?
Well, let me update everyone on the status of all that. So over the past several months, we've had, in fact, Vice Chair for Supervision Barr has held a series of discussions with the other bank regulatory agencies around potential changes to the original proposal. I'm pleased to say that we've made quite a bit of progress on those and are very close to agreeing on the substance of those changes. And I can't really be specific because nothing is agreed until everything's agreed, so I won't have a lot of specifics for you today. The question where we're continuing to try to make progress is that of process. So it is my view, it is the strongly held view of members of the board that we do need to put a revised proposal out for comment for some period. And the reason is, when there are broad and material changes, that has been our practice. We don't see a reason to deviate from that practice. It seems to be consistent with past practice and with the Administrative Procedure Act. So that's very much what we think. And we're working through that question with the FDIC and the OCC. We haven't reached agreement on that, but I'm very hopeful that we will. We're prepared to move forward when we do reach agreement on that.
Well, I appreciate most of your response there. I do want to discuss one aspect more of Basel before we move on to another topic. I find it very concerning with how much of this proposal, this process, appears to have been done behind closed doors. The Fed, the FDIC, OCC proposed Basel III endgame last July. Then in October, the Fed began the collection of data to conduct a quantitative impact study on the cost of Basel III proposal, a study which I will note should have been conducted before any proposal was ever issued. Move forward to January of this year, Vice Chair Barr committed to a public comment period once results of the study were published. We are still waiting to view the results. Keep in mind, all the while, we're hearing rumors that the Fed is working on revising its proposal and moving towards an updated version. Please help me understand, how will the Fed revise or reissue a capital proposal before receiving public comments? Basically my question.
Well, as you know, we have received extensive public comments, and we've also evaluated the quantitative impact survey that you mentioned.
Yes.
And so the idea would be when we do reach agreement with the other agencies fully, that we would publish the proposed changes and also the quantitative impact survey, and also the effects that the QIS suggests that the changes would have. So we'll put all that out for comment again for a period of time, and then having had yet another round of comment, and we can then move toward finalizing. That's basically the broad strokes of how I would see this moving forward.
And how long do you see that opportunity for public comments?
So it would be meaningful. I mean, it might be 60 days. We don't need to it doesn't need to be a long one. But, before we do that, there's a lot of work that needs to take place, before you actually put out the revised proposal. Quite a bit of work. So it will take some time, and then we would put it out, and then there would be, I'm just taking that number, 60 days of comment, and then we would get the comments back, and there would be another period of evaluating the comments, and only then would you go final. So there are a number of steps here.
Yeah, thank you. Well, just final point as I'm running out of time here. I think Senator Reid made the comment about the Chevron case and the impact that it could have, certainly in curtailing, from my perspective, the regulatory state. the necessity of a cost-benefit analysis on new regulations that will impact the economy, I think, is quite helpful. In the thousand-plus pages of Basel III, I think there were about 20 pages that reflected some kind of cost-benefit analysis approach. I really hope that we see more of that going forward.